It was during a particularly hot summer that my friends and I decided to do something different. We chose to camp on a remote beach in Oregon, known for its unexplored beauty and complete isolation. It was the kind of place where the stars seemed to shine brighter, and the sound of the waves was the only noise breaking the absolute silence of the night. We arrived in the late afternoon, with the sun still high on the horizon, casting a golden light over the white sand. Little did we know that night would be forever etched in our memories. We quickly set up our tents, excited about spending the night by the sea, far from civilization. The beach was deserted, with no signs that anyone had been there recently. The setting was perfect: clear sky, a gentle breeze, and the calm ocean reflecting the colors of the sunset. Everything seemed to be in perfect harmony, and soon we were around an improvised bonfire, sharing stories and laughing, without a care in the world. Night fell softly, and with it, the sound of the waves became more pronounced, almost hypnotic. We stayed there for hours, talking about everything and nothing, feeling the freedom of being in such an isolated place. The only light besides the fire was the full moon, shining brightly in the sky, illuminating the beach in a nearly magical way. For a moment, I felt completely at peace, as if nothing bad could reach us there. But that sense of security would soon be shattered. It was my friend Alex who first noticed something strange. He was looking towards the sea with a curious expression on his face. When we asked what it was, he simply pointed to the sand. There in the moonlight, we could clearly see a set of footprints, starting at the edge of the ocean and heading towards our camp. The footprints were large, as if made by a barefoot adult. However, what caught our attention was the fact that there were no other marks, as if someone had emerged directly from the ocean and started walking towards dry land. Curious and a bit suspicious, we stood up and followed the footprints. They were perfectly outlined in the sand, as if made recently, but there was no sign of another person around. The footprints continued in a straight line, passing near where we were sitting, and then headed towards the middle of the beach. That's when something even stranger happened. The footprints, which until then had been so clear and defined, simply ended abruptly in the middle of the sand, as if the person who made them had vanished into thin air. We were all stunned. We stood there, staring at the spot where the footprints disappeared, trying to find a logical explanation for what we were seeing. But there was nothing. No return marks, no evidence that someone had walked away. Just the inexplicable end of a series of footprints that came from the ocean and stopped in the middle of nowhere. The sense of security we had earlier dissolved, giving way to a growing unease within each of us. The unease we felt upon seeing the footprints disappear in the middle of the beach soon turned into an urgent need to understand what was happening. Something inside me told me that this was not normal, that those footprints didn't belong to anyone ordinary. Maybe it was the absolute silence that had settled, or the fact that we were so isolated, but I felt that we couldn't just ignore what we had seen. We decided to follow the footprints more closely, hoping to find some clue that would explain their sudden appearance and disappearance. As we approached the spot where the footprints ended, we noticed that the air around us seemed denser, almost as if we were entering a different space, a place where the world followed its own rules. Every step we took towards that spot seemed to carry a strange weight, and the sound of the waves, once soothing, now felt like a distant, almost threatening whisper. As we got closer, the sounds began to change. What had once been the calm breaking of waves on the shore now became something deeper, almost guttural, as if something far beneath the surface was moving. We stopped for a moment, exchanging nervous glances, but no one wanted to be the first to suggest turning back. There was something hypnotic about it, a morbid curiosity that pushed us to continue, even when all our instincts told us we should leave. When we reached the end of the footprints, we stood in a circle around the spot where they disappeared. The sand there seemed strangely disturbed, but there was no strong wind or ocean movement that could have caused it. One of my friends, Ethan, knelt down and began digging in the sand, thinking that perhaps something was buried there. But the more he dug, the stronger the feeling that something was wrong grew. The sand was cold, much colder than it should have been, and it seemed to have no end. Suddenly, we heard it. A low sound, like something moaning beneath the sand. It was subtle at first, but soon it became louder, almost like a muffled scream. We all instinctively backed away, but Ethan kept digging, now with a look of panic on his face. "There's something here," he shouted, as his hands sank into the cold sand. The sound intensified, echoing around us, as if the beach itself was alive and suffering. Finally, something happened that made us run back to the camp. The sand where Ethan was digging began to move on its own, as if being pulled by some invisible force. A small vortex formed, spinning slowly but with an intensity that made us feel we were about to be sucked in. Ethan tried to pull away, but his hand seemed stuck, and the sound, that guttural distant scream, was now almost unbearable. With one last effort, we managed to pull him away, and we all ran back to the camp without looking back. What terrified us most was the silence that followed when we stopped. The sound had disappeared as suddenly as it had started, but the air around us was still charged with a palpable tension. The spot where the footprints had ended now seemed farther away than ever, as if it belonged to another dimension, a place that didn't belong to our world. And that night, we all stayed awake, alert for any sign that whatever had been there would return. We knew we had awakened something, but what we didn't know was how close it was to reaching us. After we hurried back to camp, the atmosphere was filled with fear and tension. That guttural sound, the movement of the sand, and the feeling that something was very wrong had left us completely shaken. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all terrified of what we had found. We sat around the fire, trying to warm up and find some sense of safety, but the night seemed darker and colder than before. As we discussed what we should do, whether to stay or leave immediately, Ethan stood up, saying he needed a moment alone. He was clearly disturbed, still in shock from what had happened when he tried to dig in the sand. We watched him walk towards the sea, thinking he just needed some space to collect himself. But as time passed, we began to worry. Ethan was taking too long to return. I called out for him, but there was no answer. A few minutes later, I decided to go after him. When I reached the edge of the water, there was no sign of Ethan, just the vast darkness of the ocean stretching out before me. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the sand, just like the ones we had followed earlier. They were fresh and led from the edge of the sea to the spot where Ethan had disappeared. But what scared me the most was that, beside Ethan's footprints, there was another set, exactly like the first, but deeper, as if made by something very heavy. I ran back to the camp and called the others. When we returned to the beach, the footprints were still there, but Ethan was not. Panic took over. We screamed for him, searched around, but there was no sign of a struggle, no indication that he had tried to escape. It was as if he had simply disappeared, as if something had taken him without a trace. The only evidence was those footprints, which ended exactly where the others had disappeared the night before. From that moment on, the fear became unbearable. We decided we had to leave immediately. We packed our things as quickly as possible and started walking along the trail that led back to the road, constantly looking over our shoulders, expecting at any moment to see those footprints following us. The feeling of being watched never left us, and the sound of the sea, which had once been comforting, now felt like a threatening presence, as if something was watching us from the depths. When we finally reached the road, everyone was in shock. We couldn't explain what had happened to Ethan, and the fear that he was still out there somewhere haunted us. We reported his disappearance to the authorities, but when they returned to the beach the next day, they found nothing. The footprints had vanished, and there was no sign of Ethan or anything else. It was as if he had never been there. That was the end of our friendship as a group. We never spoke about that night again, and we all went our separate ways, trying to forget what had happened. But I never could. The footprints, the sound, and the look of terror on Ethan's face before he disappeared still haunt me. I can't go back to a beach without remembering that place, that night. And I wonder, to this day, what really happened on that Oregon beach. Who, or what, was walking beside us in the sand? For as long as I can remember, I've always had an insatiable curiosity for horror stories and local legends. That's what led me to the small fishing village on the coast of Newfoundland, known for its rustic beauty and, of course, the scary stories the locals loved to tell. The most famous legend was the cry of the drowned man, a terrifying sound that, they say, echoes on the nights of the new moon, coming from the cliffs surrounding the village. The villagers believed that the sound came from the spirit of a sailor who had drowned centuries ago, crying out for revenge. They said that those who heard the cry were destined to disappear into the sea, taken by the spirit in search of new souls to keep him company. The idea of such a dark curse fascinated me, and the more I heard about the legend, the more I wanted to discover the truth behind it. I arrived at the village on a cold afternoon, and the place was exactly as I had imagined. Weather-worn wooden cabins, boats anchored in the small harbor, and the salty smell of the sea permeating the air. The villagers were reserved, but not unfriendly. However, when I mentioned the legend of the cry of the drowned man, their expressions changed instantly, as if I had touched on a forbidden subject. They avoided talking about the legend, and when they did, they were brief and cautious, as if afraid of waking something unwanted. Despite the warnings and the discomfort of the locals, my curiosity was stronger. I decided that I would spend the night of the next new moon on the cliffs, where the cry could supposedly be heard. I prepared as if I were going on an expedition. I took a video camera, a powerful flashlight, and an audio recorder. I was determined to capture any evidence I could find and, who knows, unravel the mystery of that ancient legend. On the night of the new moon, the sky was covered with thick clouds, and the village seemed quieter than ever. It was as if everyone had retreated to their homes, waiting for the night to pass without incident. I walked to the cliffs, guided only by the dim light of the flashlight and the constant sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. The wind was cold and biting, and the feeling of being alone in such a remote place gave me a strange mix of excitement and fear. When I finally reached the highest point of the cliffs, I sat down and began to set up my equipment. The moon, almost invisible behind the clouds, cast a pale light over the choppy sea. I turned on the audio recorder and positioned the camera, adjusting the focus to capture the vastness of the ocean in front of me. The silence was almost absolute, interrupted only by the sound of the waves. For a moment, I wondered if all of this was just a superstition, a story made up to scare curious tourists like me. That's when I heard it for the first time. A distant sound, almost imperceptible, but standing out among the noise of the sea. It sounded like a moan, or perhaps a deep sigh, carried by the wind. I looked around, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing but darkness and rocks. The sound repeated, this time louder, and I knew I had found what I was looking for. The cry of the drowned man was real, and I was about to discover what it really meant. When the sound repeated for the third time, louder and clearer, I felt a shiver run down my spine. That wasn't the sound of the wind or the waves. It was something much deeper and more disturbing. I stood there, frozen for a few seconds, trying to process what I was hearing. The cry seemed to come from all directions, as if carried by the sea itself, echoing between the cliffs and blending with the sound of the water. It was a sound that carried despair, pain, and something else that I couldn't immediately identify, but that made my heart beat faster and my body tremble. I decided to turn on the camera and start recording, adjusting the focus to capture any movement that might appear on the horizon or in the water. The cry continued, more and more insistent, as if being pulled to the surface from some very distant place. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I began to question whether I was really alone there. I turned several times, sweeping the area with a flashlight, but there was nothing but shadows and the constant sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. As I tried to keep my focus on what I was doing, the fog began to form around the cliffs. It was a thick fog that seemed to come out of nowhere, enveloping everything in a ghostly mist. The cry continued, now closer, almost as if it were moving towards me. I knew I should be afraid, but my curiosity was still greater than any urge to run. I wanted to understand what was happening, wanted to capture some image or sound that would explain what that cry was. That's when my camera captured something strange. A shape, initially indistinct, began to form on the screen, moving slowly through the fog. At first, I thought it was just a reflection or a recording error, but the shape continued to approach, taking on a more defined form. I couldn't see it clearly with the naked eye, but through the camera lens, it was possible to make out a human figure, dragging itself through the fog towards me. It seemed to be struggling against some invisible force, moving with difficulty, as if trapped between two dimensions. The figure moved in a strange way, almost as if it were floating above the surface of the rocks. I tried to focus the camera, but the fog made everything more difficult. With each second, the shape came closer, and the cry, that desperate, painful sound, grew louder, more intense. It was as if the figure was pleading for something, trying to communicate, but all it could do was make that cry that chilled my blood. It was at that moment that I realized something was very wrong. The figure in the fog stopped moving, and for a brief moment, the cry ceased. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, as it seemed to be the prelude to something worse. The shape, now still, seemed to be staring at me, though I couldn't make out a face or clear features. The feeling of being watched intensified to the point where I could barely breathe. It was as if that presence was probing my soul, searching through every thought, every fear, every memory. Before I could react, the shape moved again, this time faster and more determined. The cry returned, more piercing than ever, and I felt a force pulling me towards the sea. I tried to back away, but it was as if the ground beneath my feet was disappearing. The camera slipped from my hands, but continued recording. All I could do was scream, a scream that mingled with the sound of the drowned man. As the figure in the fog came closer and closer, until everything around me turned to darkness. The darkness that enveloped me seemed eternal. When I finally came to, I was lying on the rocks, the cold of the ground seeping through my clothes. The fog had disappeared, and the night was strangely silent, as if the world was waiting for something. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was or how I had gotten there, but then the events of the last few hours began to return, each detail filling my mind with an overwhelming sense of terror. I looked around, and in the dim light of the moon that now peeked through the clouds, I saw the camera lying a few meters away, still functioning. I got up with difficulty, feeling every muscle in my body protest, and went over to the camera. I picked it up with trembling hands, and with a lump in my throat, I started reviewing the recording. What I saw and heard in that video made me question my own sanity. The recording started as I remembered, the distant sound of the drowned man's cry, the fog forming around the cliffs, and the shape that seemed to emerge from the depths. But as the video progressed, I began to notice details I hadn't seen before. The figure in the fog was clearer than I had imagined, its features distorted and inhuman, as if it were trapped in endless agony. With every movement, it seemed to disintegrate, reassemble, and distort in impossible ways. The sound in the video was even more disturbing. Besides the cry, there was now a cacophony of whispering voices, as if an invisible crowd was speaking all at once. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was one of despair and fear. These voices seemed to fill the space around me, creating a growing pressure, as if they were trying to drag me to the same fate as the shape in the video. I could hear my own scream in the background, blending with the voices, until everything became one single terrible symphony of horror. But what really paralyzed me with fear was the end of the video. When the figure in the fog approached, the camera captured something I hadn't seen before. A second shape appeared, coming from the opposite direction, moving quickly towards me. There was no doubt that it was hunting me. When the two shapes met, the camera shook, and everything became a blur of frantic movement. The screen went black for a few seconds, and then a final image appeared. The video ended with a final scene, frozen on the screen, showing an indistinct figure, seen from behind, disappearing into the sea. But what was most disturbing was that on the shore, there was something that looked like my own silhouette, floating, as if I had been torn from the place where I was and taken to that dark fate. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. It was as if the video had captured not only the present, but also a glimpse of what was to come. The fear I felt at that moment was paralyzing. I knew I couldn't stay there. The camera, now almost an unbearable weight in my hands, contained something I should never have seen, something that shouldn't exist. Without thinking twice, I turned off the camera and started running back to the village, without looking back. With every step, the sound of the cry still echoed in my ears, as if it were following me, chasing me. The next morning, the camera was found exactly at the spot on the cliffs where I had been. I was never seen again in the village, but the video, with that last frozen image, became a legend in itself. Some say that if you watch it until the end, you can hear the drowned man's cry coming from the sea, calling out to you. And those who hear it, they say, are destined to disappear, taken forever by the dark waters of Newfoundland. It was a search for isolation and inspiration that led me to that remote part of Brittany, France. As a horror writer, I've always believed that the best stories come from dark, forgotten places. That's why I chose to spend a night in the old abandoned lighthouse, located on a small rocky island, accessible only during low tide. The lighthouse had a tragic history, but that only fueled my curiosity. Stories about the lighthouse keeper who went mad and threw himself into the sea seemed like the perfect setting for the next great horror story I was planning to write. The journey to the island was not easy. The slippery rocks and quickly rising tide made the journey more dangerous than I had imagined. Upon arrival, I was greeted by an imposing but decaying structure. The lighthouse stood alone, its stone walls worn by time and the elements. The strong wind made the place seem even more desolate, as if the entire island was suspended in time, waiting for someone to break the silence that had lasted for decades. I entered the lighthouse with a sense of excitement mixed with apprehension. The air was damp, and the smell of salt and mold permeated the atmosphere. There was something about the place that immediately made me uncomfortable, but I ignored it, attributing it to the heavy atmosphere and isolation. I was there to write, to capture the essence of that place in words that could terrify and fascinate my readers. I decided to explore the lighthouse first, walking through the lower floors, which were empty and dusty, with old furniture covered by sheets. As I climbed the spiral staircase leading to the top, I felt a strange presence, as if I weren't completely alone. The steps creaked under my feet, and the echo of my own movement seemed louder than it should have been. The silence was thick, and the only sound besides my footsteps was the wind banging against the broken windows. When I finally reached the top, the lighthouse keeper's room was exactly as it had been left. Dusty books piled on a table, a rocking chair facing the window that overlooked the endless sea. That's where I found the diary. It was hidden in a drawer, wrapped in an old faded cloth. When I opened it, I noticed that the pages were yellowed and fragile, but still legible. The first entries were routine, describing the lighthouse keeper's daily life, the weather conditions, and the ships spotted in the distance. But as I continued reading, the words began to change. The tone became darker, more desperate. The lighthouse keeper started describing visions, inexplicable noises at night, footsteps he swore he heard on the upper floors. The last pages of the diary were almost illegible, written in a trembling, almost scribbled handwriting. He talked about a presence that followed him, that watched him. The loneliness had turned into something much more terrifying, something he couldn't escape, no matter how hard he tried. The final entry was written on the night he threw himself into the sea. It ended abruptly, with incoherent words, as if he had been interrupted in the middle of his last note. As I read the diary, the first signs of noises began to emerge. A soft creaking, as if something was being moved on the floor above. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the wind. But as the sounds became clearer, footsteps, whispers, I began to feel the same fear that the lighthouse keeper had described. I knew I had to get out of there, but the tide had already risen, isolating me on the island until dawn. With the old diary in my hands, I sat in the rocking chair, trying to make sense of what I had just read. The wind howled outside, and the lighthouse swayed slightly, as if echoing the feelings of despair that filled those yellowed pages. The lighthouse keeper's words continued to resonate in my mind, and the discomfort I had felt since arriving on the island was now much more intense. I continued reading, diving into the pages that described the lighthouse keeper's slow descent into madness. He mentioned that for weeks he had heard footsteps he couldn't explain, sounds that seemed to come from the lighthouse itself, but could never be traced to a concrete source. At first, he believed it was his imagination, a consequence of prolonged isolation. But as the days passed, the manifestations became more frequent and intense. The lighthouse keeper began to feel a constant presence around him, something invisible but undeniably there. The descriptions were terrifying. He spoke of whispers that came from nowhere, voices that called his name and woke him in the middle of the night. The lighthouse keeper mentioned shadows that seemed to move through the corridors, always out of sight, but that he knew were there. He even described a figure he saw several times reflected in the room's mirror, an indistinct silhouette that materialized behind him but disappeared as soon as he turned around. The lighthouse keeper's fear was palpable in every line he wrote. He began to lose sleep, staying awake through the nights, waiting for the presence to reveal itself. The final pages were almost incomprehensible, scribbled in a frenzy of terror. He talked about the feeling of constantly being watched, of something or someone always lurking, waiting for the right moment to manifest. The lighthouse keeper was convinced that the island was cursed, that something ancient and evil resided there, and that he had been chosen as a victim. The last entry in the diary was the most disturbing. He wrote that he could no longer bear the presence, that it was about to take over him completely. The words became increasingly incoherent, with sentences that seemed to plead for help, mixed with confessions of despair. The last sentence, written in large, trembling letters, said, "I need to end this before it takes me." And that's where the diary ended, making it clear that on that night, the lighthouse keeper decided to end his own life by throwing himself into the sea in a final act of despair. As I processed what I had read, I began to hear the sounds that had disturbed me earlier again. The footsteps, which the lighthouse keeper described in his diary, were now echoing through the corridors of the lighthouse. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, influenced by the words in the diary. But the footsteps were getting louder, closer, and I knew I wasn't imagining things. That presence the lighthouse keeper had described, that invisible entity, now seemed to be behind me. I got up from the chair, my heart racing, and tried to convince myself that it was all just the effect of the grim reading and isolation. But when I heard a whisper, a low guttural sound that seemed to come from all sides at once, I knew I was in danger. The lighthouse, once just a desolate and melancholic place, now seemed alive with a sinister energy. I knew I needed to get out of there, but the tide had already risen, completely isolating me. The footsteps continued to echo through the corridors, and the whispers grew louder, as if multiple voices were trying to speak to me at once. I was overcome by a deep fear, something I had never experienced before. It was as if the island itself was trying to expel me, or perhaps claim me as its next lighthouse keeper. I decided that the only thing I could do was wait for the tide to go down and try to survive until dawn, but with each passing minute, the sounds grew more insistent, closer. As the night wore on, the sense of entrapment became increasingly real. The lighthouse, which during the day seemed like just an old, abandoned building, now turned into a labyrinth of shadows and sounds that defied all logic. Every step I took was followed by those same invisible footsteps, which seemed to echo through the narrow, dark corridors, as if the very structure of the lighthouse was alive, conspiring against me. I hurried down the spiral staircase, trying to stay calm, but the terror seeped into my mind. The whispers, once distant, now seemed to be all around me, in every direction. Each word I couldn't decipher was a torment to my sanity. I was being hunted by something I couldn't see but could clearly feel. The lighthouse keeper's diary, still in my hands, seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if the words written on the pages were coming to life. When I reached the lower floor, the strong wind blew against the broken windows, bringing with it the salty smell of the sea and something else, something that smelled of decay. I looked out the window and saw the waves crashing violently against the rocks, the high tide completely isolating the island from the rest of the world. The darkness was total, except for the brief flashes of lightning that split the sky, revealing the bleak landscape outside. The idea of jumping into the sea, as the lighthouse keeper did, crossed my mind, but the fear of being swallowed by the dark waters was even greater than the terror I felt inside the lighthouse. I stayed near the entrance door, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was all the result of fatigue, the suggestion provoked by reading the diary. But when the footsteps returned, now slowly ascending the spiral staircase that I had just ascended, all attempts to maintain logic failed. The voices that had once whispered were now louder, almost like a macabre chant, blending with the sound of the wind and waves. They were calling me, summoning me to something I couldn't understand, but knew was inevitable. Desperate, I tried to lock myself in one of the lower rooms, but the doors never seemed to close completely, always leaving a gap through which the sound could pass. The whispers were closer, and I felt that at any moment something or someone would appear there with me. The feeling of being watched was so intense that it was as if thousands of eyes were fixed on me, studying every movement, every breath. That's when I realized the mistake I had made by deciding to spend that night in the lighthouse. I wasn't just a witness there, I was the next chapter in a story that kept repeating itself. The lighthouse keeper, driven mad by the presence he described in his diary, hadn't been the first victim. And now, by following in his footsteps, I was destined for the same end. The voices, the footsteps, and the invisible presence were there to ensure that the cycle continued. Finally, panic completely took hold of me. I grabbed the diary and threw it away, as if that could somehow break the spell that seemed to be holding me there. But the effect was the opposite. The whispers turned into screams, and the footsteps started rushing towards me. I knew I couldn't stay there, that I needed to get out, but the tide was still high, and the sea seemed like an extension of the darkness that was trying to engulf me inside the lighthouse. Then, when the footsteps were almost upon me, I did the only thing left. I ran outside towards the sea. The cold and violent waves were a constant threat, but they were the only escape I had. I preferred to face the unknown in the dark waters than be captured by whatever was chasing me inside the lighthouse. The water engulfed me with its coldness, and as I struggled against the current, the screams from the lighthouse began to fade, replaced by the roar of the sea. I swam with all my strength, not knowing if I would reach the shore or if I would be carried away by the currents. Fear drove me, and each stroke took me farther from the lighthouse and the presence that inhabited it. When I finally reached a safe place, exhausted and trembling with cold, I looked back and saw the lighthouse, a dark silhouette against the horizon. I knew I would never return, but I also knew that what I experienced there would follow me forever.